This is a presentation from Stephen Rogers. This presentation is on the differences from classical theory versus rational choice theory. This is a presentation from Stephen Rogers. This presentation is on the differences between classical theory and rational choice theory. To have a better understanding of how we got from classical criminology to the current rational choice theory, we have to follow a specific order. And that order will begin with classical criminology origins, positivist criminology, sociological criminology, developmental criminology, rational choice theory, evaluating the risk of crime, analyzing rational choice theory, evolutions of classical theory to rational choice theory. We'll have a design statement of how we got to those points, and there will be a reference of where we got those points from. As in any pattern of learning, it is very important to understand where those origins come from. And in classical criminology, the origins are rooted far before the actual theory, because in Middle Age times, the thought of how to deal with crime was by torture, whether that be for the punishment or for the actual crime. And in a normal sense, those punishments were harsher than what the actual crimes were, because the thought process was that if someone was severely tortured, then they would not commit a crime. But these mindsets started to change by the mid 18th century, and philosophers started to think about how they could reform crimes better and use different philosophies of how punishment should be better fitted for certain types of crime. And the person that is given the most credit for the changing in this philosophy is Cicero Beccari, and he was one of the first individuals to form a system and ask the question why people committed crime. And around this time is when classical criminology theory, it developed a sort of definition. And that different definition as follows: is the theoretical perspective suggesting that people choose to commit crime and that crime can be controlled if potential criminals fear punishment. This new classical understanding of criminology fostered in a new philosophy called positivism. Positivism is simply a philosophical system that holds that every rationally justifiable assertion can be scientifically verified or is capable of logical or mathematical proof. This gave the criminologists of the time a new way to look at crime, and these systems were sometimes done in different and more radical ways than they ever were before. Some of these criminologists, they studied the biological part of criminologists, and they would attribute certain characteristics of an individual to criminal behavior. Lavater, he attributed certain shapes of ears, nose, eyes, and the distance between a, a subject's ears in reference to criminal behavior. Other criminologists like Gall and Spurzane, they studied the shape of skulls and bumps on the head, concluded that physical attributes were linked to criminal behavior. There was a criminologist, Lombroso, from Italy. He would do studies on actual cadavers of subjects that were executed, and he believed that criminals had inherited traits that were different from those that did not commit crimes. He found that those physical characteristics would determine whether those subjects would commit crimes. And his radical thinking and studies, they made their way to the United States, where people continued to do biological studies on whether criminals were attributed to more physical attributes. During the same time, there were also thinkers that believed that criminal behavior was linked to parts of the mind, of the psychological side, and one of those thinkers was Pinel, who started the French psychiatry, and he believed that the human mind was linked to criminal behavior or criminal patterns. All of these new thinkings, they led to even more people who still were positivists, but they started thinking of crime in in different types of conditions. One of those thinkers was a gentleman named Emil Durkheim. And Durkheim, he attributed crime to the social condition, which leads us to sociological criminology. Social Sociological criminology is best defined as the approach to criminology based on the work of Emmanuel Durkheim that focuses on the relationship between social factors and crime. He was a social positivist, and he believed that crime is something normal, and that is because it is impossible to picture any society without crime. He also believed that people are so different from one another that they use different methods and different types of behaviors to meet their needs. And he also believed that even if real crimes were eliminated, human weaknesses and petty vices would be elevated to the status of crime. He also believed that crime could be useful in a social sense for social changes, that they might, a person might speak his mind on how society works, and that would be deemed a crime, but eventually the changes would have to be made because the social condition had not been met. Positivism also showed up in different forms. There was also sociological criminology theory, and this form of positivism is best noted by Emil Durkheim. And Mr. Durkheim believed that his approach to criminology was that social factors had something to do with crime. He believed things like social positivism, crime is normal. And he viewed that because he thought that there was no way that you can look at a society and picture that society without there being crime. He also viewed that people use different methods to deal with different situations, so they would therefore have different behaviors. He also viewed that if you were to eliminate any crime, that humans would still have vices and that those vices would be elevated to actual crime. Durkheim also thought that crime could be useful sometimes for social means and that they could possibly bring about social change. A good example of that would be the civil rights movement, even though some of the Jim Crow laws were actually laws that had to be enforced. It took radical breaking of those laws to bring about some types of changes. We note in this era that now groups came together, sociologists, and they would study the relationships between environmental conditions and crime. This happened during this era of positivism. Positivism didn't also bring along biological testing. It also brought along different philosophies from different people. And one of those philosophies was sociological criminology theory. Sociological criminology approach to criminology was based on the works of Emil Durkheim, and it focused on the relationship between social factors and crime. He was a positivist, but he believed that some crime was actually normal and that it was impossible to picture a society that didn't have crime. He also thought that people were very different and they used a wide variety of methods and types of behaviors to meet their needs. And he also thought that even if crime was eliminated, that people had petty vices and that those vices would be seen as crimes. He also thought that crime could be useful from a societal standpoint, that some laws that were unjust and that they needed to be broken. A good example of that uh, in future tense past Durkheim's time would be the civil rights movement. A lot of the Jim Crow laws were laws that people weren't allowed to break, but by breaking these laws, it brought great social change. He also thought that there were no real norms because morals and values change quickly, and that the people in a society would figure out what they thought was or was not acceptable. During this period, for the first time, Chicago School of Sociologists they started to study the relationship between environmental conditions and crime. This led to a key phrase, socialization, which simply meant the processes of humans developed and enculturation. Socialization is influenced by key social processes and institutions. Another radical thinker of the time was Karl Marx. Karl Marx believed in conflict criminology theory, which simply stated the view that human behavior is shaped by interpersonal conflict and that those who maintain social power will use it to further their own ends. Marx was convinced that the character of every civilization is determined by its own mode of production. He felt like the most important relationship in industrial culture is between the owners of the means of the production and people who perform the labor. And that simply means that he thought that people who held that the power, they had the control over the economic condition of the people. He felt like the economic system controls all facets of human life, and people's lives revolved around the means of production, and the working class was exploited. And he thought that this would eventually lead to a conflict between the upper class and the lower class. And this theory can also be termed as critical criminology, and that is simply the view that crime is a product of the capitalistic system, that the system actually creates a climate for crime. All of these different radical beliefs had different ideas about criminal behavior. And it wasn't until the Glicks, the husband and wife team of criminologists and researchers at Harvard Law School, conducted numerous studies of delinquent and criminal behavior. This is very important because for the first time, studies start to be looked at from all angles, from the sociological, the physiological, and the economic situations of an individual. And do all of those things play a factor in crime? This is very important, and it's called the developmental criminology because for the first time, it wasn't just one simple factor that was thought that a subject would be more prone to be involved in criminal behavior. Now, the belief, the more modern belief, was that all of these things played a factor in whether that person was susceptible to criminal behavior. Developmental criminology theory was the leading theory for most of the 20th century. Then along came rational choice theory. This theory is very clear and is defined as the view that crime is a function of a decision making process in which the potential offender weighs the potential cost and benefit of an illegal act. This new way of looking at crime theory was completely different in the fact that it looked at the individual and that individual's decision making as a major factor in why people committed crime. And there's a very important process that that individual goes through to determine whether they will or will not commit a crime. They will evaluate the risk of the crime. In rational choice theory, law violating behavior is the product of careful thought and planning. An individual, before deciding to commit a crime, the reasoning criminal evaluates the risk of apprehension, the seriousness of expected punishment, the potential value or benefit of the crime enterprise, his or her ability to succeed, and the need for criminal gain. That individual will also take into consideration a specific type of offense, specific selected characteristic of a potential criminal act, Does that individual have a specific skill, a motive, a need, fear before he commits that act? Will it be a structuring criminality? Crime is offender specific. Several personal factors and conditions must be evaluated before someone decides to choose criminality. Some of those things are peers or guardians. Do they have people that will monitor them or tell them that doing that crime is wrong? Are they a thrill seeker or do they seek excitement? Do they have some type of economic need or some type of economic opportunity? Will they be competent or experienced enough to commit that crime? Structuring crime. According to the rational choice approach, the decision to commit crime, regardless of its substance, is structured by where it occurs or the characteristics of the target and the means to get away. All of these things will play a part in whether an individual decides that they will or will not commit a crime. Radical choice theory also asks rational questions that the classical theory didn't answer, didn't ask. It asks questions like, is crime truly rational? Is drug use rational? Is violence rational? Is hate crime rational? Is sex crimes rational? These are new concepts to criminology that the classical theory did not consider. The evolution of classical theory to rational choice theory. Before classical theory, an individual was punished severely for a crime, and there was no level of what that punishment was. It wasn't equal to the crime. It was so that person wouldn't do the crime anymore. Classical theory began by asking the very important question of why people commit crime. This sparked a new age in criminology. Prior to this, no one asked that question. This important question led to a new age of criminology called positivism. Positivism, for the first time, criminalistics would use different methods to study the causation of criminal behavior. Prior to that, subjects were only punished, and no one even tried to understand why individuals would commit such crimes. Positivism would not only study the biological makeup of criminals, but it lead to advancements in the understanding of sociological, physiological, and psychological effects as causation to criminal behavior. So this whole era, it led to different types of thinking. Sometimes that was radical, where we started to believe that certain characteristics would mean that that individual would be involved in criminal behavior. But it also led to the understanding that there were psychological effects that had a causation to criminal behavior as well, which would foster in uh, the understanding of the brain and the effects on the brain on a subject being involved in criminal behavior, which are important to criminology. This would also lead us to understand that there were many, many different factors to criminal behavior. So the stage from going from the classical psychological conflict criminology theory to the developmental criminology theory, which encompasses uh, all of those factors, would be a important step to get to the rational choice theory. Even though all of those theories are different, they lead to a sort of evolution of understanding and asking the right questions in criminal behavior, which will eventually lead to even better questions and better advancements in the future. Design statement. Assignment was to compare classical theory with rational choice theory. I went to chapter 1 of the text and collected all important information pertaining to the classical theory. I then went to chapter 4 of the textbook and collected all the information pertaining to rational choice theory. I created a PowerPoint presentation with information taken from each theory, compared the concepts, added narration to the presentation, and downloaded the video file to YouTube. I then provided the link to the instructor.